The Christian life is, by definition, a life of seeking and reward. You pray fervently, fast with discipline, strive to live righteously, and feel that your faith is unshakable. However, time passes, and the doors remain closed, progress stagnates, and answers seem not to come. This is one of the most painful frustrations of the faith journey, feeling that you are giving your all, but something invisible is sabotaging your communion with the divine. Often, when faced with this spiritual wall, our first impulse is to look to heaven and ask, "What am I doing wrong?" Or else, we look inward, searching for some secret sin. But the Bible, with its ancient and surgical wisdom, reveals that the greatest obstacle to your prayer life and prosperity may not be in your heart or in heaven, but rather in the circle of people you have chosen to keep close. It's not a direct attack, but a subtle contamination. The ancient Jews deeply understood the importance of contact and of relational purity. They knew that the quality of those around them directly influenced the quality of their spirit. This understanding wasn't just about rules, but about an immutable spiritual principle. The energy, faith, or contention of those around us acts as a filter, for good or for evil, on our own lives. They were very selective about who they shared their bread and their intimacy with. In this in-depth study, we will confront an uncomfortable but liberating truth. There are people who, due to their spiritual nature, their unbelief, or their inner conflicts, act as negative spiritual filters, absorbing or nullifying the strength of your faith. You need to identify these blockages to protect your purpose and your peace. It's a matter of discernment, not judgment. Don't skip this video, because over the next few minutes, you'll discover the 3 biblical signs unmistakable to identify and neutralize these influences. The process of clearing your prayers and moving forward begins today, with a courageous decision to protect your spiritual atmosphere. Begin to pray with discernment, for you are about to discover what has been hindering your journey. To understand how someone can block your prayers, we need to revisit the theology of contact. The Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 6:17, states that whoever is united with the Lord is one spirit with him. However, the principle of unity of spirit also applies to our human relationships, albeit on a different level. Sharing intimacy, plans, and energy with someone means, in part, merging your field of faith with theirs, creating a mutual vulnerability. In the Jewish historical context, the concern with ceremonial and social purity was gigantic. The law dictated who could or could not touch you, who could or could not enter your house. This went beyond hygiene. It was about preserving the spiritual integrity of the individual and the community. If a person was in a state of impurity, your association with them could contaminate you, delaying rituals and, symbolically, your communion with God. The prophet James emphasized this connection between relational purity and effectiveness in prayer, in James 5:16, saying that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Righteousness here is not only individual righteousness, but also righteousness in our relationships, to be at peace and in truth with those to whom we are connected. Any contention or falsehood creates spiritual friction that hinders the ascent of your prayer. The problem in modern times is that we ignore this discipline. We allow people with a contentative spirit, those constantly involved in arguments, gossip, and dissatisfaction, into our inner circle. You may be at peace, but that person's contentious spirit is so strong that, by absorbing their complaints and negative state of mind, your own conviction is weakened. The practical application is immediate. If you spend hours listening to someone's bitterness, your field of faith is contaminated by that heavy atmosphere. The state of mind of your closest confidants is contagious, and if they live in doubt and conflict, this negativity acts as a dirty filter over your own field of prayer. The first line of defense is not the longest prayer, but the sharpest discernment. The first sign, criticism disguised as help. The first and most treacherous sign is the constant criticism disguised as realism, caution, or practical advice. This person has the uncanny ability to find the flaw in every promise and the reason why every dream is impossible. They never support. They always question its viability, always injecting a poisonous dose of doubt just when your faith needs a boost. In the Old Testament, We find the alarming case of Mical, King David's wife, as recorded in the 2 Samuel 6:16, mocked and despised David for humbling himself to worship God in front of the people. Her reaction was not merely social criticism, but a disdain for the king's expression of faith and joy. She scorned the act that connected David with God's purpose and the joy of the people. The interesting thing here is that the immediate and final consequence for Mical was sterility. The biblical text states that she had no more children until the day of her death. This barrenness was not merely a physical punishment, it was a spiritual consequence of her mocking spirit against faith. Where there is contempt for God's purpose, the ability to generate life and reap fruits is cut off, for faith is what generates spiritual life. The lesson for our daily lives is clear. Destructive criticism from someone you associate with acts like a barren seed planted in your soil of faith. If you constantly share your prayer requests and plans with someone who ridicules or sabotages them with skepticism, the power of your conviction is drained before you even finish saying, Amen. Criticism doesn't just kill the dream, it weakens the voice of faith. Observe your circle. Who is always ready to remind you of your failures or risks, but never to celebrate your victories or encourage your spiritual boldness? That person, even if well-intentioned, is creating an atmosphere of doubt around you. If your faith is the bridge that connects heaven to earth, criticism is the fire that constantly burns the supporting cables of that bridge, making your prayer journey insecure. This first sign has a mechanism of action that is theologically devastating. The power to nullify faith through unbelief and through constant skepticism. The Bible teaches us that faith is the substance, Hebrews 11:1, and without it, it is impossible to please God. When someone close to you injects unbelief into your life, the substance of your faith dissolves into doubt, rendering prayer ineffective. The clearest example of this is found in Marcos 6:5-6, when Jesus attempted to perform miracles in his own city, Nazareth. The text shockingly states that he could not do any great work there, because of the unbelief of his fellow citizens. Jesus' power was not limited, but the atmosphere of disbelief created by the people who knew him, it nullified the manifestation of his power. The curious thing is that the blockage wasn't in Jesus, but in relational atmosphere that he encountered. Those who should have been his supporters knowing his past, isn't this the carpenter, were the ones who doubted the most. This collective disbelief acted as a negative force field, preventing miracles from flourishing. Jesus, in turn, was simply amazed at their lack of faith. Bringing this into your circle, if you consistently share your visions and prayer requests with those who have a spirit of Nazareth, you are planting your seed in bad soil. The prayer becomes blocked because the environment where it is being planted is saturated with skepticism. The person doesn't need to be bad. It's enough that they don't believe in their potential to nullify their own conviction. The emotional impact of this is chronic insecurity. The skepticism of others makes you doubt your own ability to discern God's voice. A critical person makes you revise your plans and question your sanity. The mechanism of the barren seed is subtle. It doesn't make you sin openly, but it prevents you from moving forward, emptying the authority of your faith through incessant doubt, paralyzing your journey. The second sign, silent envy. The second sign is the most treacherous and requires the utmost discernment. Thesilent envy. Envy is the inability of a person to genuinely rejoice in your own success and prosperity. This envy doesn't shout. It manifests itself in lukewarm praise, a sudden change of mood when you share a victory, or a quick change of subject when the conversation is about your success. The biblical archetype for this sign is the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Cain's envy wasn't just about Abel's offering, it was about the acceptance's envy of God. The Bible shows that Cain's envy became so intense that it blocked his own communion with the Creator, culminating in violence and curse. The spirit of envy, if left unchecked, attracts an atmosphere of death and dissatisfaction. The interesting thing about this story is God's warning to Cain. The Lord tells him that sin lies at the door. This is not just a metaphor. Envy opens a door to destructive forces waiting for the opportunity to act. Being connected to someone who cultivates the spirit of Cain in their heart is to attract that same heavy and unresolved atmosphere into your life, sabotaging your peace and your relationship with the Father. The theology of contact teaches us that if prayer is the search for God's peace, then hidden dispute it is your greatest enemy. Relationships based on falsehood, comparison, and envy maintain a state of latent and unresolved conflict. You may not be fighting, but the other person's internal war drains the serenity of your spirit, destroying the atmosphere of peace necessary for a sincere and effective prayer. The modern application is clear. Observe your friend's reaction to your news. The envious person always tries to level things down, finding fault with your blessing or reminding you of how much work remains to be done. This silent contention steals joy, and joy is our strength. Without joy and peace, faith becomes heavy, and prayer a burden, hindering the manifestation of divine response in your life. Delving deeper into the issue of contention, we must remember that the biblical concept goes beyond verbal fighting. Contention is unresolved internal war that an individual projects onto their environment. In Proverbs 17:1, Eastern wisdom states that a dry morsel with peace is better than a house full of strife. This shows that in ancient culture, the spiritual atmosphere it was worth more than material wealth. The blockage of prayer is often caused by this latent contention. The Apostle Peter, 1 Peter 3:7, warns husbands and wives to live in harmony, so that may your prayers not be hindered. Although the context is marital, the principle is universal. Unresolved conflict, falsehood, and internal warfare between spiritually connected people create an insurmountable barrier to celestial communication. The interesting thing is that the conflict doesn't have to be yours to affect you. The person with silent envy is in conflict with oneself and with God, because it questions His justice in blessing you. Being connected to that kind of soul is like connecting your electrical system to a house with a short circuit. Your energy will be drained, and your spiritual system will suffer collateral damage. You absorb its instability. The danger of relational falsehood lies precisely in this. You believe you are at peace, but the atmosphere is charged with resentment. Prayer requires peace, so that God's voice may be clear and your faith firm. When the soul is restless and on edge due to hidden contention, the concentration and conviction necessary to sustain a request before God simply vanishes. Therefore, the solution is not simply to distance yourself, but to identify what is causing the friction. The emotional consequences are constant stress, unexplained anxiety, and the feeling that you are always fighting alone. Peace is your environment of faith. Anyone who disturbs that peace is a direct threat to your prayer life and must be dealt with radical discernment. The third sign, the constant drain of energy. The third sign is the most physical and subtle, the constant draining of your emotional and spiritual energy without reciprocity. These are the people who act as freeloaders, constantly demanding your time, attention, and emotional energy, but never offering support or encouragement in return. You always end the conversation feeling exhausted, confused, and weaker than when you started. The Bible, especially in Proverbs, makes a clear distinction between wisdom that builds and the craziness which destroys. The drainer is often the fool who seeks only to satisfy their own needs and vent their own problems, completely ignoring the well-being and spiritual state of the wise. They use their light to dispel their darkness, but without caring if you will be left in the dark. The curiosity here is the habit of Jesus withdraws from the crowd. The Gospels recount that, frequently after long periods of ministry and healing, energy drainage, Jesus would withdraw to solitary places. He did this not out of selfishness, but to recharge your spiritual energy and to seek clarity. He understood the principle that, in order to give, one must be nourished from a pure and exclusive source. The modern interpretation is that your spiritual reservoir has a limit. If you allow people to constantly unload their complaints, dramas, and skepticism on you, your reservoir of faith and encouragement will run dry. You will no longer have the fuel of peace and conviction to sustain your own struggles. Prayer requires a certain reserve of encouragement that the constant drain depletes. The consequence of keeping these drains for free is Chronic fatigue and spiritual burnout, you become their psychologist, counselor, and problem solver at the expense of your own communion with God. Radical discernment is needed to differentiate between compassionate help, which builds us up, and selfish drain, which destroys us. Wisdom demands that you protect your time and energy. To correct the problem, we need to model the greatest example of relational wisdom, Jesus Christ. The Master managed his social circle with radical discernment, establishing different levels of closeness: the crowd, the 70, the 12, and the inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John. He knew that intimacy should be reserved for a few, not for everyone. In biblical culture, numbers had both practical and spiritual value. Circle of 3, Jesus' support was not due to favoritism, but because purpose. They witnessed moments of glory, transfiguration, and moments of greatest pain, Gethsemane. They were the inner circle of Jesus' greatest trust, those with whom he shared his intimacy and weakness. Not everyone can be in that circle, for not everyone can bear that weight. The lesson of Judas Iscariot, it's the hardest but the clearest. Jesus knew exactly who Judas was and what he would do, but kept him within the wider circle, the 12. He did this to fulfill God's purpose, but never gave Judas the same intimacy he gave Peter or John. Jesus teaches us that we can love and interact with our neighbor, commandment, but we must be intentional about it, who enters our circle of 3. The key is that you need to prioritize your relationships. You can love your neighbors, your co-workers, and even your difficult relatives, but you must protect the intimacy of your spirit. The people who have full access to your dreams, fears, and prayer requests need to be those who foster faith, not criticism. This is a choice of wisdom, not selfishness. The emotional consequence of not discerning is chaos. Unconditional love is for everyone, but trust and spiritual intimacy are not. Failure to protect this inner circle allows the spirits of contention and skepticism, which we saw in signs 1 and 2, to enter and gain direct access to your faith, hindering your prayer. Protecting your privacy is protecting your bond. The solution to this blockage is not complete isolation, but contract readjustment. The Apostle Paul advises in Romans 12:18, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Note the distinction, if it is possible and as far as it depends on you. The focus is in your inner attitude, peace, and not in the other person's response. The context of Romans teaches that peace is not passivity, but an active stance of not allowing the contention of others to invade one's inner self. If someone insists on living in criticism or envy, their responsibility is to maintain inner peace and love, not hatred or judgment, but establish a safe distance. You love the person, but you detach yourself from the contamination of their spirit. Practical action is the conscious and non-destructive distancing. If the person is draining you, sign 3, set time limits on conversations. If they criticize you, sign 1, stop sharing your dreams and prayer requests. You don't need to fight, you just need to close the doors to your spiritual intimacy. The distance may be physical, but most of the time it's purely emotional and informative. The most liberating power in this process is the forgiveness. Forgiveness is what spiritually disconnects you from the other person's blockage and contention, even if you choose to keep your distance. You forgive the criticism and envy, which nullifies their power to harm you and restores your own inner peace, which is the necessary environment for effective prayer. Prayer only flows fully again when an atmosphere of faith and peace is restored. If you are at peace, internally and externally, but the other person remains contentious, their contention can no longer block you. Restoring your field of faith requires courageous but absolutely necessary relational decisions so that the Holy Spirit can operate freely in your life. Today we've compiled one of the most powerful truths about prayer. The blockage you're facing may be more relational than spiritual. We've dissected the 3 biblical signs of the negative influence: disguised criticism that sows disbelief, silent envy, which generates hidden contention, and the constant drainage, which drains your energy for prayer. We understand that the ineffectiveness of their prayers was not due to a lack of devotion, but to an urgent matter of Discernment. Knowledge of God's Word and the wisdom of history teach us that protecting our sphere of faith is a personal and non-transferable responsibility. True spiritual freedom lies in the courage to love everyone, but to protect the privacy of a few. The Bible teaches us that wisdom is paramount. Therefore, you can no longer ignore the warnings. Freedom from spiritual shackles begins now with the decision to readjust your relationships and restore peace to your heart. Do not allow skepticism or the envy of others to continue acting as dirty filters over your blessings and your purpose. If you found this content helpful, please follow the channel. Here we explain the Bible with historical depth applied to real life, in a way that transforms understanding and wisdom. Click on follow and continue on this journey. The Bible is ancient, but its answers remain alive. And if you learn to listen to it, you will see life with a clarity that few possess.